Hello, and welcome back to Philosophy 1050, an introduction to philosophy. This is Lecture 12. And today, we're going to be covering Immanuel Kant. Kant was born in a highly religious family, like Hume, in the town of Königsberg, Germany. Like Socrates, however, he stayed in his hometown all of his life. He went to university there when he was 16. He became a tutor and then a paid lecturer after graduating from university. And then eventually he became the chair of logic and metaphysics at the University of Königsberg. So Kant's main goal in starting out his philosophical career was to resolve the debates between the rationalists and the empiricists. Rationalists versus the empiricists. His main contributions, therefore, lie in epistemology, but his ethics are equally, if not more, influential. That being said, we're not going to be focusing on them this class. I will say a little bit about them in a few moments, but we're going to have to leave it at that. So to start off, because as usual, we're going to give kind of a brief overview of Kant's contributions to philosophy. So the first thing, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today with our reading, is Kant's theory of knowledge. So empiricists were basically winning the debates between rationalists and empiricists. With Hume on the scene and the arguments that we read last lecture, it seemed as though the tide was in favor of the empiricists. And Kant was even swayed by Hume himself away from being a rationalist, because originally Kant considered himself a rationalist, but then he read Hume's arguments and he just couldn't consider himself a rationalist anymore. But he also couldn't consider himself an empiricist, because ultimately he thought that the empiricists were missing something too. So Kant's revolutionary insight into epistemology is that we don't experience the world as it is, but rather we experience the world through an interpretive lens constructed by our minds. So in other words, we always have some sort of rose-colored glasses either coloring our view or actually radically underpinning our ability to see the world. So there's this distance between what we see and the world as it really is. And I'll say a little bit more as we go on. Therefore, asking whether knowledge comes from reason or from experience just doesn't make sense, because your experience is already conditioned by your reason or your intuition. So there's this sort of like middle ground that Kant is trying to go to. He's trying to bridge the gap between these two schools of thought. So Kant says that if our intuition must conform to the object, then nothing can be known a priori. But if the object must conform to our intuition, then things can be known a priori. Now, at this point, it's important to take a pause and take a look at these words that I'm mentioning. We covered the words a priori and a posteriori in our last lecture, but let's put them up on the board again. A priori, a posteriori. So that's the first set of distinctions. But there's also a second set of distinctions that is often paired with this that is very important in philosophy. I mean, at this point people have in some ways gone past these distinctions, but this was a very important step. And that step was also having this concept of analytic and synthetic. So let's go through these really quickly. A priori is knowledge that can be known. Let me switch pens here. Before the senses. And a posteriori is knowledge that can only be had after the senses. But what about analytic and synthetic? We haven't covered that one. Well, that one in some ways is similar, but not quite. Analytic is knowledge that you can get from the definition of a thing. So, for example, and this is the example I've been using throughout this course, for a triangle, it is by definition, in some ways, that its interior angles add up to 180 degrees. Although that might be a little bit farther. Something more simple that we could say is something like, it is by definition that a triangle has 3 sides. That would be an analytic truth. It's also another example that's very popular in philosophy, although we're not going to be covering the philosophers that used it here, is that a bachelor is an unmarried male. That is a truth that is known by definition. Therefore, it's analytic. Now, what about synthetic? Well, if analytic is a truth that you know by definition, then synthetic is a truth that you know from outside of a definition. So, for example, if you're trying to, let's say, the truth of where I am right now, it's a synthetic truth because there's nothing about the definition of me, of Zeno, which is by definition requires that I am here. I could be in many different places, and so in order to find out the truth of where I am, you need to go outside of the definition of what I am and actually do a little bit of searching. So that's just a brief little bit of definitions that are going to help us going forward. The main ones to look for in this reading here are going to be these two. So, that to come back to what Kant said, if our reason and intuition must conform to the sensible world, then nothing can be known by reason alone, before appealing to the senses. But should we assume the opposite, that objects of our experiences conform to our intuition, that the experiences we have in some ways are conditioned by our reason, well, then we can know things by reason alone, or a priori, in other words. So Kant wants to say that just because all knowledge begins with the senses, being convinced by the sort of empiricist points that the senses are very important, it doesn't follow that all knowledge arises from the senses. There is a part for the mind to be played. Some knowledge is produced by the mind regardless of the particular details of an experience. So having given that brief introduction to Kant's theory of knowledge, which tries to provide a synthesis between the rationalists and the empiricists, let us now briefly turn to Kant's ethical positions, because we're going to be covering his epistemological positions in more detail when we get to the reading. So, Kant is widely known as the forefather of one of the major branches of modern ethics, known as deontology. So let's make some room for this. Probably get rid of these definitions here. So, deontology. And that basically means duty-based ethics. Although Kant mostly based it on rationality. Now, if you recall in one of our earliest lectures, in fact, lecture 1, uh, we had that sort of chain of reasoning or that conceptual scheme which underpinned our concept of freedom. Well, the sorts of arguments that I was using to give you that conceptual chain were the ones provided by Immanuel Kant. He was the one that said, or at least emphasized within his moral theory, the fact that humans are rational beings. And because they are rational beings, there is something special about them. What's that special thing? The special thing about rational beings is they have the ability to choose what they're going to do. There's something respectable in of itself of a being that is able to make decisions for itself. And so Kant developed a moral theory based around respecting that aspect of a person, around respecting a person as a rational thing and therefore an end in itself. So he rejected relativistic and hedonistic notions of morality and wanted to establish instead a morality based in absolute and unconditional terms, something that he thought he could base in the solid foundation of reason itself. Now, within this moral rule by reason, Kant is famous for providing two versions of what he calls the categorical imperative, or, in other words, the primary principle behind morality, or at least Kant's flavor of morality. So let's just quickly give us an idea of what those are. Well, version 1 of the categorical imperative is act only in such a way that you could will it to be a universal law. So, what does this one mean? Okay, well, basically in this he's trying to say don't do anything that it would be inconsistent or logically impossible for everyone to do. So things that fall under this, for example, are things like lying. So his argument against lying based on this is something like, if you lie, then you must be willing to allow everyone to lie, to allow it to be a universal law that everyone lies. But if you make it a universal law that everyone lies, then lying loses its meaning because you can no longer trust anyone. And so, therefore, you cannot lie because making it a universal law would be self-defeating. The second version that Kant gives is treat people as an end in themselves and never as a mere means to some other end. So this is the second version. And this one is basically just trying to say that rational beings, humans, are this very special fall into this very special category of thing that has to be treated as an end goal, as something that you do things for. And you're not allowed to treat humans as something that you only use for the sake of something else. Or in other words, you're not allowed to just use people as objects. You need to always treat people as people, and what that means is treating them as an end in themselves. So, for example, if I were to, let's say, kill you and steal your money, I would, in that case, be using you as just a mere means to some other end, because I'm in no ways trying to aim at the goal that is you by improving you or making you well. I'm instead entirely ignoring that and looking at some other goal like wanting $50, and so I'm using you as a mere means to some other end. So that's not allowed. So these are the two basic formulations that Kant gives for his moral theory. And with all that introductory work out of the way, let's move on and take a look at the reading for today. We are looking at just the preface of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, second edition. Now, Kant is a very deep thinker and he has a lot of influence. However, one thing I can say about Kant is he is one of the more difficult philosophers to read because of how dense his thinking is. He doesn't have bad thinking, he doesn't have unclear thinking, he has very dense thinking. And so for that reason, for the purposes of this class, we're just going to be limiting ourselves to the preface to this work. If you want to and you're interested, you can keep on reading, and I guarantee you can find this work pretty much anywhere on the internet, in your local library. It's going to be there. So, with that said, let's turn to the critique. So Kant begins the critique by stating that we can figure out whether reason is a science by looking at its fruits, or in other words, by what you get out of using reason. So if reason were to constantly lead to in different directions and fail to explain things, then, says Kant, it wouldn't be a science. But if so, then it's important to lay out a path for reason, because clearly in that case it'd be confused. So it's important for us to, not make it unconfused, make it clear. This is true even if that path may, in some cases, make questions from the past meaningless, like Hume argued for. So Kant is saying that even if that's the bullet we have to bite, or the bitter pill we have to swallow, so to speak, then we still have to do it because it's important enough to get reason on a straight and narrow path. Logic itself, however, seems to be on a pretty sure and stable path, at least since Aristotle. At least in Kant's time, logic hadn't developed very much since Aristotle. Today there have been quite a few advances in logic, but even in some sense the basis that Aristotle established is still there, even if it has been modified and added onto a little bit. So in some sense Kant is saying that as far as reason being a science, the logic part of reason does seem to be a science already. Logic, Kant says, aims to give an exhaustive definition and strict proof for all rules of thought. Science must have a priori knowledge within them to be in order for something to be a science, it must have a priori reason. In order for reason... gosh, I'm really biffing this, aren't I? Science must have a priori knowledge within it in order for reason to play a role in science. There we go. And if science does have a prior knowledge in it, like mathematics and physics, but math more specifically, because, for example, mathematics seems to have become a science in some sort of forgotten revolution, says Kant. Its discoveries were made by finding truths implicit in their concepts, and so mathematics does have a priori knowledge in it, and so therefore it does require reason. Natural science seems to have also natural philosophy seems to have started on the path to being a science since the work of Bacon and, in quotations I'm adding this here, Descartes. Around that time, the ideas of what science and how to be rigorous about science started, and at this point Kant is just pointing that out, that it seems that even natural philosophy, which is the philosophy about things in the world seems to have started becoming a science at that point. He says that reason learned that it must interrogate the world and that it cannot stand on its own. And that's kind of the big thing that natural philosophy started changing. Metaphysics, however, is not a science yet. There's still much disagreement about metaphysical truths, and Kant says that it's a battleground still. So therefore, it is still mere groping in the dark at concepts, or at least that's what Kant calls it. But does that mean we should give up on metaphysics and be discouraged about the role of reason that can be played within it? No, says Kant. We should instead try and change our assumptions and see if our conceptual schemes work out better. Here Kant is trying to compare what he's doing to what Copernicus did. By changing the focus of his system from the Earth to the Sun, Copernicus was able to make all the math work in a more clean and accurate way. Similarly, Kant wants to change the focus of metaphysics by shifting the direction of influence from the world influencing our intuitions to our intuitions influencing our appearance of the world. Now, remember that quote about our intuitions affecting our sensory perceptions that I mentioned in the introductory portion of this lecture? Objects, or at least objects as we experience them, and that's the key thing here. It's our experiences of objects might conform to our intuitions, or in other words, to the way our mind is already structured. And there's an important distinction to be understood here. So what's that important distinction? Well, the important distinction is between these two things. One is called noumena, and another one is called phenomena. Now, noumena is the real world out there beyond our experiences. So, the real world independent of our sensations or senses. And so if noumena is the real world, or at least the world independent of our senses, then phenomena is the world dependent on our senses. World that we perceive of senses. So the phenomena is actually the, how should I put this, the experience that you're having in your mind. When light comes into your eye and goes through your retina and then goes into your brain, by the time it hits your brain and you're actually having an experience of it, it's no longer the thing out there. So that's what Kant is trying to get us to think about here, that there is a sort of distance between the objects out there in the world and our actual perception of those objects. Now, if we say that intuition conforms to objects, then we're unable to imagine the unconditioned, or in other words, the noumena, without contradiction. But if we say that objects in our experience conform to intuition, so if we say it's the other way around, or in other words, our phenomena conforms to the way our mind is set up, then we can make sense of the idea of noumena, because the noumena is this extra step beyond the phenomena. Kant wants to just basically at this point set out a method for metaphysics, but he doesn't want to set out a full system yet. And he has a whole bunch of other books that he works on this. So if you are interested in where he goes with this, you can read the rest of the critique and his other works to get some more idea about that. But here, at least, he's saying all he wants to do is just set out the method, the sort of process by which metaphysics could happen, not to actually do metaphysics. So, in other words, he wants to set the limits to the internal structures of a metaphysical science. Metaphysics, by setting out principles and limits based on these principles, can become a completed science. So metaphysics, if it's reined in, can become a science. Indeed, provided this, it is set to discover the nature of pure reason, says Kant. Thus, a main function of Kant's work is negative, setting out the limits of speculative reason, but in doing so also allows reason to employ, and so for that reason it's also positive. Now, negative and positive don't have quite the same meaning in philosophy as they do in day-to-day life. It's not so much about being bad or good, but rather about whether you're arguing something is wrong. So if you're saying that that is false, then you're making a negative argument. Conversely, to make a positive argument, you have to argue for something. You'd be arguing that that is true. So here Kant is saying that he's not just being negative. He's not just saying that metaphysics can't do this or metaphysics is wrong. He's also trying to be positive by saying that metaphysics can do that and metaphysics can be true. So basically, Kant is trying to say here that the only way we can get to arguing about metaphysical things correctly is by stopping arguing about metaphysical things incorrectly. So that's what he wants to focus on. So Kant goes on, all things we can theoretically know are limited to experience. Some things cannot help but be viewed by pure reason, such as that there are corresponding objects to our experience, or in other words, that there are noumena. That we have free will is also known by pure reason and not through the senses. For example, free will is not self-contradictory. We can imagine freedom. And here Kant is really making a very important distinction, because he's saying that there are some things that we can't know absolutely. Because knowledge requires the senses. It requires the empiricist input. So Kant is saying there is some limits that we can have on our pure knowledge, but there are things we can in some sense know through our pure reason, and those are things like our free will or the fact that there is noumena out there. For example, if we assume that morality presupposes freedom, then that is a point in freedom's favor. Morality grants practical principles on the supposition that freedom, and if we supposed instead that freedom were self-contradictory, then we would have to discard morality. But since freedom, or the idea of freedom, is not self-contradictory, because we can imagine freedom, we can keep morality even if it implies that we are free. So in other words, just because we can't know that we are free by observing it, we can nevertheless act as though we are free, and therefore in some sense believe that we are free, because there are certain things that we require in our lives, like morality. Morality requires our concept of freedom. And since our concept of freedom isn't contradictory, then we can keep our morality, and therefore we get freedom as a free bonus in some sense. Now, morality doesn't require that we understand how the will works in the way that Hume insisted, as we covered in our last lecture, only that freedom doesn't contradict itself. The same thing can be said of the concepts of God and immortality, and he covers these in more detail in his other works. If without these concepts we run into contradictions or practical difficulties, then they are prescribed by pure reason. In other words, if we can't help but believe a thing in order to function in the world, then that thing is in some sense prescribed by pure reason, and so is part of the lens through which we must see the world. Kant says at this point a famous quote of his: "I have therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith." And basically what he's saying here is that he's okay with biting Hume's bullets, with eating Hume's bitter pill of being able to say, or accepting that we don't have any proper knowledge about free will, the kind of knowledge that is based on the senses. We don't have that. But that's okay, because we can hold on to our belief of free will by appealing to different things, like the thing that we want to hold on to, this idea of morality. Well, morality presupposes free will, therefore we must have free will. And so it doesn't matter whether we can explain how free will works, and it doesn't matter whether we've actually seen free will in action in some proper empiricist sense. It just doesn't matter. To Kant, what matters is that there are certain moves that we can make through reason in order to preserve certain beliefs. Ultimately, Kant scolds people like Hume, stating that metaphysics will always be around, even despite Hume's reasoning. So it is better to criticize the sources of metaphysical errors rather than trying to throw the project out completely, because that's just not going to work. So Kant thinks criticism of reason is necessary. Only criticism of reason can stop things like materialism, fatalism, atheism, free thinking, fanaticism, superstition, idealism, and skepticism. Now, I do want to make a note here. So obviously, Kant was religious, and so it stands to reason why he would see atheism as negative. But what about free thinking? What was that? Well, the way it's being used here, free thinking isn't so much the fact that you're just allowed to think freely, or, do philosophy. Isn't that what free thinking is? No, it's more something like just having very willy-nilly beliefs. You're not very careful about what you believe, and you're just kind of like, oh, I'm a free spirit, yeah, I believe whatever, oh yeah, so kind of not being careful, not doing philosophy is something that criticizing reason can stop, says Kant. Now, these are all out of control schools of thought that try to preserve unreliable ideas that the public has never properly heard of. Dogmaticism, in Kant's view, then, is the operating of reason without the limits of a critique, such as one which reveals that reason must limit itself to the speculation of the senses. In all, Kant concludes the preface by insisting that in order to understand even one part of his book, you need to understand, including the preface, you must also understand all the other parts. Luckily, I don't expect you to read through the whole critique of the pure reason, as entire classes can be taught on just this book alone. What I do expect you to do, however, is get these two most basic points of Kant. So I'm going to write these down. So the first one is our experiences of the world are conditioned by our minds, and so there is a distinction between the world as we see it and the world as it really is. So that's the first point that I really want to hammer home with Kant, because he can be a little bit confusing to understand. So if there's one thing that you take away from it, it's this. The second thing that I want you to take home from what Kant is trying to argue for here is we must be willing to relax what we can know in favor of what we must have faith in, such as freedom or such as the noumenal world, or if you want to go into his other works, such as immortality and God. So that's the two things I want you to take away from Kant. And with that, this concludes this lecture. Join me next time, where I'm going to be covering some of the philosophy that's occurring in what's known as environmental philosophy. See you there.